Hello, everybody. This is Gary. Today is Tuesday, October 22nd, 2019. It is 1:05 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the United States. And this is my coping with schizophrenia vlog entry for today. And I wanted to answer one question that is an answer that's changed over the years. And the question is, when can you force somebody into a mental hospital, regardless of what their mental illness is? Schizophrenia is only one mental illness out of very many. The American Psychiatric Department, the American Psychiatric Association keeps a book called the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual, and it's put out by the American Psychiatric Association, and it defines which mental illnesses are real and what their symptoms are, and how to diagnose them. So there are many potentially dangerous mental illnesses out there, and that brings up the question, when can you force somebody into a psychiatric or a mental hospital? Originally, it used to be the criteria that the person that you're putting into the hospital couldn't take care of themselves in work, in paying their rent, paying their mortgage, taking care of children. They were unable to get food and shelter, and so you often end up in a mental hospital, say during the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, simply for not being able to take care of yourself. You would end up homeless if you weren't in a hospital. You would go hungry if you weren't in the hospital. Um, Being potentially violent and potentially suicidal was only part of the criteria that could put people into a mental hospital against their wills. But now those two criteria are the only time you can force somebody into a mental hospital. It's not just about whether or not the patient can take care of themselves or not, but whether or not they're potentially violent or potentially suicidal. Those are the present criteria that have to be met if you're trying to force somebody into a mental hospital, whether that's a relative or a friend or whoever it might be. Um, if they're showing potential signs of violence or being suicidal, you can force them into the hospital, or at the very least go in for evaluations and be observed for 72 hours. That's in New York State. You can force somebody in to the hospital for 72 hours of observation. And if you're seen by one psychiatrist, within a few days, you have to be seen by a second psychiatrist who will determine if you need to stay in the hospital more than 72 hours. And again, you have to prove, well, not prove, but indicate that the person is potentially violent to other people or potentially suicidal. Um, so those criteria have changed drastically over the years, because now if a person becomes homeless or they become hungry or they can't hold a job, none of those things are criteria for admitting somebody to a mental hospital against their will. Um, and that happened in leading to homelessness for hundreds of thousands of mental patients from the early 1960s all the way through the 1990s. Mental hospitals were closed. I believe a total of 500,000 hospital beds were eliminated by the end of Ronald Reagan's presidency in the 1980s, and it was called deinstitutionalization, and it was originally meant to give civil rights to people who are mentally ill, so they wouldn't have to spend their entire lives in a mental hospital. But it was a misguided gesture to get people out of the hospital, because it created hundreds of thousands of homeless, mentally ill people, and it still does today. Um, I think the only reason I'm not homeless is because I take my medications um, on schedule the way I'm supposed to, and I have been uh, put into the hospital involuntarily before, when I indicated I was suicidal or violent. So if I was feeling distressed because I was hearing voices, I was paranoid, I was suspicious of other people, I was hallucinating, I was extremely uncomfortable, that by itself isn't a reason to put somebody into a mental hospital. In other words, even if I feel like shit for whatever reason, hallucinations, delusions, and I want to go into the hospital, they don't necessarily admit me into the hospital, because I'm not given any indication that I'm violent or suicidal, just that I'm extremely uncomfortable from my mental health symptoms. So there are very, very few hospital beds left in the United States. One of the state hospitals that most states had was Rochester Psychiatric Center here in Rochester, New York. It was the state hospital for this area, and it was closed, and then a new one was built with a lot less patients. The original Rochester Psychiatric Center held 1,000 patients. Now the one that was rebuilt, I believe, holds less than 100 patients, and a lot of people were homeless when the state hospital closed, and that unfortunately has ramifications even for today. I was out walking down the street today because I had to go to the store and pick up my medications, the pharmacy, and I see people lying with pillows and blankets on the sidewalk and doorways, and it just makes me wonder how many people do that because of their mental illnesses and are lying open in the weather. It's raining right now here in Rochester. It's not the warmest day in the world. It's not quite snowing yet, but the person that I saw today that was lying on the streets with a blanket and a pillow right on the sidewalk, that person is in a world of hurt because winter's coming up. And I guess my point is that deinstitutionalization has created more suffering than it has created civil rights for the mentally ill. And many mentally ill people who break the law end up in jails and prisons when maybe they should have been sent to a hospital and kept there for years if necessary, because deinstitutionalization was a misguided, inappropriate attempt to give civil rights to the mentally ill. So that's all for now. Comment, like, subscribe, and share. If you have any questions about mental health or schizophrenia, put them in the comment section below and I'll try to go through them and answer some of them.